Sivin, if you're still around there, it's now time to turn in English, and I will hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you so much for your warm invitation to share some thoughts for our mutual learning. I want to bring you warm greetings from Martin Junger, the General Secretary of the LWF, Lutheran World Federation, and the communion of his colleagues, many of whom have worked closely with Bishop Kaiser during her time with us. So it's an honor and privilege to have this chance to share and to be part of your important seminar. Now, I first heard of this phrase by Anders Breivik in July 2011, when I was studying in Norway for my PhD. Now, I was intrigued and how it was possible that someone who lives in a free, democratic, and peaceful and highly educated society like Norway would come to this conclusion. He said, "The time for dialogue is over. The time for armed resistance has come." And many of us remember the tragedy that happened in July 2011. Now, some commentators would have dismissed him as psychologically unstable, or critics would have seen him as, abnormal in Norwegian society. But in recent times, the growing populist and hateful rhetoric in social media and the political sphere suggests that we cannot ignore some of the underlying ideas that see all foreigners as a threat to our so-called stable societies. Now, recently, in the light of the USA elections and extremist attacks in France and different parts of Europe, I think we're increasingly alert to insecurities and hostile attitudes, especially towards the religious other. Now, coming from Asia, while there's a general sense of social harmony among people of different ethnicities and religions, I come from Malaysia, we are familiar with the experience of being a minority Christian facing public rhetoric that excludes us from society, especially when politicians use these kind of words in public. I wouldn't be surprised to hear about Muslim extremists, but nowadays we also read about Hindu nationalists in India or Buddhist nationalists in Myanmar. And increasingly, I guess you would have heard in the media about Christian nationalism, especially in the USA. Now, of course, I believe that most loving people in the congregation and our societies wouldn't call for armed resistance, and that would be the same in Malaysia too. But this doesn't mean that they might not harbor suspicion and distrust toward foreigners and people of other faiths. Besides, they might feel ill-equipped to dialogue and with people of other faiths who really visibly appear very different and foreign to what we are all familiar with. For many of them, many of us, the dialogue and genuine encounter has really yet to begin. That is why I would like to congratulate you, Elena, Bishop Kaisa, and others in the Church, Evangelical Church of Finland, for producing this important resource, these guidelines for interreligious encounter. I had the privilege of reading through it. It's well organized, thought through, covering all the important and most of the important concerns that are not only familiar for theologians like me or pastors, but is relevant for even people in the congregation and church leaders and those in other roles that you play. Now, I noticed the constant affirmation of mission and the important place of dialogue without neglecting the place of evangelism. Now, while it is clearly focused on addressing the fast-changing context of the Finnish society, but much of what is shared in the guidelines it resonates with various concerns of member churches in the global Lutheran communion. So therefore, this document is also valuable for ongoing development of resources that would benefit us all. Now, let me begin by just appreciating, now, even though we come from a broader ecumenical perspective, also LWF, we would say that to be Lutheran also is to be ecumenical, and I work closely with colleagues in the World Council of Churches and the Roman Catholic Church. Yet I found the Norwegian theologian Otto Teller's question inspirational as a valuable starting point for a distinctive Lutheran contribution. So he recounted in his own experience since 1986 through the LWF study processes on interfaith relations. I quote, he said this: "The first meeting was held in Geneva in 1986, where the theme was religious pluralism with special regard for the Lutheran heritage. So the concern was not only to motivate and prepare Lutheran theologians and church leaders to involve themselves in dialogue and to deal seriously with pluralism. A major or sub-theme was to search for a specific Lutheran contributions to interfaith dialogue. So he asked this question: can we offer insights that are unique to our tradition?" End the quote. He then continues to remind us that the Lutheran teaching on the theology of the cross has a place and function in interfaith relations and formal interreligious dialogue. So I would recommend the article also by my predecessor, Dr. Simone Sin, who reviewed the LWF trajectory since 1964 until 2008 in her article. And in the 2020 Lutheran Interfaith Reader that I managed to compile this year before COVID-19 hit us, it offers a selection of articles that I would like to recommend to give us an insight into the key issues that, very interestingly, we will find it relevant for today. Nevertheless, it is important to note that we are not just picking and choosing Luther's ideas here and there and applying it today. I learned from the late Brazilian theologian Vitor Westeller. He talks about transfiguring Luther. He uses the image of transfiguration to inspire us. And what is meant is not just picking ideas just uncritically, but to engage Luther historically, but also critically, but also to constructively adapt Luther's insights in fresh new context. Now, in my own Malaysian context, as I live as a minority Christian, as a Lutheran, I tried to revisit Luther's reflection on to what extent we should obey temporal authority. And in my own quest to transfigure Luther, I came to the conclusion there's a place for creative resistance to hegemonic political power in the name of religion and politics. But my contribution also included a need to dialogue and engage with the Muslim majority. We can't just do this alone. And I learned also from a younger theologian in his master's thesis, an indigenous Christian in East Malaysia, Joe Frick-Atting. He also engaged with Luther's notion of so-called the doctrine of two kingdoms. And but he came out with the conclusion of constructive neighborly love and dialogue, and how both of us re-engage Luther to think about our own context afresh. Is something I find that is very exciting, especially in this locally connected and global context. Now, I like the idea of transfiguration because when you go back to that text, that episode in the Bible, in the Gospels, Jesus connected both the law and the prophets through the appearance of Moses and Elijah. And I guess this is relevant for us today as we think about interfaith dialogue, because we are committed to our Christian identity, and yet we want to take risks forward to fulfill God's mission, his call upon us. So I just want to affirm the value of that Lutheran distinctive contribution. So I'm going to organize my next part on 4 simple questions. I don't have 95 theses, but 4 simple questions. And when I was doing the compiling the articles for the LWF Interfaith Reader, what I thought was important was to draw on the insights both from Christian majority context and also when Lutherans are minorities. And I felt the interaction, even between the text, had intercultural conversation that could encourage us for fresh thinking, not only from the past, but also from one another in the present. So I use 4 broad questions, and hopefully those questions can inspire us to think further, to deepen our commitment and our engagement with people of other faiths. So the first question is really very simple, right? how do we view the other religions? Another way of asking it would be, how do I see the religious other? Because it's people we're talking about. Or what are the areas we might have misunderstood them and need clarification? Early in the 1980s, the Secretary for Interreligious Relations, Paul Rajashekar from India, he said, while it is clear that a commitment to one's own confessional beliefs is a prerequisite for genuine interreligious dialogue, does this necessarily imply that the theology of religion we want to forge can be done without engagement with people of other faiths? In other words, we can't just read books, we will need to engage with real people who embody their beliefs, values, and attitudes. He then further highlights the presence of other religious communities, and coming from India, this is really interesting. He says that it should not be seen as a threat, but rather a reality with positive meaning that we must seek to discover. Then he draws on a cross-reference theological method to raise the awareness for us that we could discover similar impulses in other religious teachings. Yet, differences are not ignored, and we don't need to downplay them or just dismiss them by saying we are all the same, because we are not. But at the same time, there are impulses that it resonates with us. So we can only start where we are. I know it's popular to say we should start with focusing on what is common, but let us not underestimate how difference can often be a real invitation for genuine dialogue. And often that is out of curiosity too. In addition, it's important to take note that our dialogue partner is a person, and their religious tradition cannot be reduced in a stereotypical manner, either in one place or one time period in history. And in the guidelines, I noticed that was very carefully mentioned too. Equally, we could turn this question around. I mean, how do other religious communities look at us? How might maybe we have been misunderstood by people of other faiths, especially when they only depend on media or bad experiences? I mean, what are the specifics? So this question actually is something that I would invite my friends from other faiths to tell me. Now, we learn from German theologian and mission theologian Schumann, who spent many years in Indonesia. In fact, I think he's still there. He lists key theological issues, and he says that he wants to take note of the origins of how Muslims understand Christians, or maybe misunderstand Christians. And only then he continues with the presentation of how he sees Christ in the Quran, the presentation of Christ in the Quran, and to what extent, from a Christian perspective, we see Muhammad having some kind of role in history that can be appreciated in Christian terms, even though we have a different view of his prophetic. Now, Christian-Muslim dialogue debates actually has been plagued with a lot of rhetoric at best, and at worst is very polemical, especially at the grassroots level, and that really has real political implications. In one segment, actually, Schumann models a kind of dialogue that could emerge after we deal with all these misunderstandings. So he asked the question, or he raises this concern. He says, now Christians may now ask the Muslims whether, if the Islamic understanding of the kingdom of God is correct, is it also a kingdom which rule is identical with service, where power is identical with love? Does the Islamic kingdom exclude worldly power and restrict itself to service, seeing the mixture with world power as an unholy temptation? So he's just raising a question. And I've had similar conversations with my Muslim friends back in Malaysia, especially those who see the problematic nature of a politicized religion that affects religious minorities. So I've had a similar experience with a verse once about Jesus, and my Muslim counterpart asked, is Jesus commanding Christians to kill his enemies? And that's actually found in one verse in Luke. But as we engage deeper, I had to clarify that this is from a parable of Jesus, and it was not a command to Christians And of course, from that, it opened up different ways we look at our scriptures and interpret our texts. Now, this leads me to the next question, the second question, and is how do we speak about the disturbing or difficult and hopeful aspects of our religious traditions, whether it's in our scriptural text or in our history? Now, the first significant step for Lutherans in 1964 was really to deal with our relationship with the Jewish people. There's a unique relationship there. And we know that we have a difficult Lutheran legacy about anti-Judaism. And this is an important self-critical moment because it characterizes the approach that we want to take really starts with the capacity to face with our own historical failings. Now, the relationship between Lutherans and Jews is particularly difficult. We all know that because of the Holocaust, the harsh text against the Jews. And in fact, I once met a Jewish rabbi who asked me, why would you as a Malaysian want to be a Lutheran? So that was actually a very interesting conversation we had. Now, we have learned from scholars like Krauss that we need to be careful in the way we handle these difficult texts. There's a lot of exegetical work that needs to be done because these texts are easily misused. And he wants us to handle these texts with care, knowing that there are implications which go against the core of our faith, which is to love our neighbor. That's why he raises these questions for us to reflect. How could a religion which considers the command of love for God and one's neighbor to be central contribute to the fanning of hatred and persecution of Jews in the name of Jesus? How could the cross, as a sign of reconciliation, become a sign of bitter persecution? Where are the roots to be found? And we went through, and we still are willing to go through these difficult processes of self-critical reflection. It's not enough to say that, well, that's not true religion. It's not truly faith. Eventually, we would need to deal with the difficult texts in our scriptures. And this requires for us to look, how do we interpret those texts in our encounter? But this is also a reality that my Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu friends are also dealing with in their own tradition. And we must allow space for them, for our friends, our neighbors, to come to terms with their own interpretations too, which probably has not gone through that kind of scrutiny that we have in our Christian history. The LWF recently, or last year, managed to publish, and we have in German too, a comparative transformative reading between Christian and Muslims to face this difficult discussion. It's more of an academic discussion, but I guess sooner or later this will also be found when we're engaged in scriptural reasoning as a practice, for example. And at least we will recognize internally within their own religious communities, often the debate is very, very intense. How do you deal with these difficult elements? So this scriptural reasoning as a practice, I thought that was mentioned in the guidelines, is one helpful way forward. And often we will start with easier texts, of course. But I would also want to mention that, like some of my Muslim friends would also look at the new publications to deal with a gap in their own understanding of the Quran. So there's a study Quran right now, similar to Christians' study Bible, that Muslims are using, at least in the English-speaking world. And we'll discover that both of us look at text very differently, and we look at the life of Jesus and the life of the prophet very differently as well. So we need to pay attention to the expectations that we have to one another. And facilitating this safe space really is important. And it's not just about the past or the text, but also current stories as well. I was inspired by the statement from the conference, 2019 conference organized by Zanzibar Interfaith Center in Tanzania, where our Lutheran Church is very much involved in. And I noticed that the importance of telling stories in their call for peace, in the Zanzibar peace call. And may I quote what they said? We share stories of both religious communities using violence against each other, but also religious communities protecting each other from violent attacks of religious extremists. So indeed, I mean, we have to admit this is the reality. It's a mixed religious communities. We as sinners, we as people, we are a mixed bag. And I remember during the New Zealand mosque shooting in 2019, some of the people of different faiths showed on their Facebook feeds the reports of interfaith solidarity, and that was really important. Now, these are not necessarily statistics, but everyday stories are really often very powerful for us to engage in meaningful dialogue. For the next three, we'll go a little bit faster, but these are things that I think was also probably mentioned in Bishop Kaisa's presentation, where I could somehow follow a little bit. But the third is really, what is our understanding of mission? In the 1970s, in the beginning of the 1970s, and even today, we also hear of this concept of holistic mission, and some evangelicals use the word integral mission. And the emphasis here is really the combination of evangelism and diaconia. And it's a complex relationship between gospel and culture, was also mentioned. Now in the LWF, we are engaged with humanitarian work through the World Service, which is very much focused on humanitarian standards. But we also have member churches that are engaged in diaconic work, in development work that still recognizes the place of evangelism. So holding this together, holistic mission, and then highlighting the role of faith actors in humanitarian work, difficult place to be, and we are continuing to work on this. Of course, the LWF talks about mission as proclamation, diaconia, and advocacy. But I would also see that mission in this sense also includes the importance of a dialogue that cuts across all in different ways. Now, in recent years, many Lutheran in the Lutheran communion see the need to reclaim the true meaning of evangelical, which is found in the name of your church, Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. And how it is related to the good news is even more urgent in today's world, because this word, especially from where I come from and from what I'm hearing, the word evangelism, evangelical, has really been associated, sadly, with white supremacy, having a superior attitude over the others. And this would horrify the original writers of the gospel. And that's why I noticed in the recent document from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and also in your document, you still very much want to reclaim this word evangelism as a very respectful and important word that must not be surrendered to those who might be using it in a way that is many times unhelpful. And commitment to interfaith dialogue does not mean that we give up on the need to share respectfully what our faith means for us and what God has done in our life. In the recent webinars that we have done in the LWF, we talked on religious nationalism, populism. So it was also a dialogue on the meaning of different words. For example, when we talked about populism, we were reminded how popular or people is still a good word, but populism now has a very negative connotation. In Indonesia, we are reminded that nationalism, to some of them, is not necessarily a bad word, and perhaps this is because of translation. Is closer to being patriotic rather than being narrow. So a citizen should be nationalistic in a good sense. Similarly, words like mission, evangelism are two important words that I'm glad you have not neglected in your guidelines and in your discussion of dialogue. And I would see that many regions outside of Finland would resonate positively with the insights, the theological and biblical insights that are found there. And especially I found highlighting Acts chapter 17, the model of Paul, to be very helpful. But we need to pay attention to how good news now is experienced by the others, maybe as bad news. And especially that has been corrupted by politics and politicians or dominating powers to the powerless. I mean, I've learned from my friend Munter Ishak from Munter Isaac from Palestine, a Christian, who addresses the topic of Christian Zionism. And he, of course, his interest is historic too, but he situates his work in the lived reality of the Palestinian territories. And he talks about the impact of right-wing Israeli religious nationalist groups, as well as Christian Zionism that is often supported by USA evangelicals. And he says that, and he's troubled by how religion, ethnicity, and nationality is just mixed together there. And so we need to have a lot of discernment about this as now. I'd like to just quickly close because that really leads to the public aspect of this, and this will be my final point for next maybe another 3 or 4 minutes to end. The fourth is, how do we see the role of the church and other faith communities in the public space? You notice I put there and other faith communities too. I mean, how do we deal with the resurgence of religion in the public sphere? I guess the church sees our role in society, and we can't speak in generalities. I like the document in the guidelines that highlights the Finnish church and the changes and challenges you face. Now, in Europe in the 1990s already, Hummel, a German, already highlighted and anticipated many of the struggles today revolving around people on the move, about migration. Now, in Asia and Africa, in many cases, as minorities, maybe we would say we would rather be left alone to practice our faith freely. In some countries, propagating the Christian faith has public and legal consequences. Nepal, Myanmar, Malaysia, for example. However, our friends in Hong Kong recently shared with us in the Asian Lutheran Leaders Conference last year how the June 2019 mass demonstrations really forced the church to think about what does peace mean in the context of Hong Kong, and what is interreligious relations and dialogue and in this new light. Because some of the church saw themselves suddenly opening up for rest and counseling for the demonstrators at that time, and then social service spaces were transformed into interfaith spaces. So that this is no longer the traditional notion of interfaith dialogue where we sit comfortably and just have a discussion about what we believe, but this dialogue happens on the streets. This dialogue happens as they engage and struggle with authoritarian regime and highly pressured political climate. So this reflection for me also makes me wonder, and is something I would ask my friends of other faiths, how would they see their role in society? What are their aspirations? Because some may just prefer to have a privatized faith, like some of our own Christians, but others might say they want to contribute constructively to society. So rather than seeing them as threats, perhaps they also are opportunities for interfaith contribution. And in closing, the fact that we are talking in this way shows that the COVID-19 pandemic really has disrupted our lives in an unprecedented manner. And for interfaith relations, this is really difficult because now we always talk about physical distancing. So how do we engage with one another when we can't even visit one another's religious sites and physical meetings are not as accessible as before? Besides that, there are more information that people get, usually from the media and not directly from us. And the media tends to highlight sensational news, extremes. And then what's dominating social media could be fake news, disinformation, even hate speech. So as we await for the vaccine and now find different ways to cope this pandemic, our commitment still is to constructive interfaith engagement. So I'll just close with a challenge from the LWF General Secretary, Martin Junger, where he shared this in his lecture for the San Egidio prayer meeting under the theme Peace Without Borders, Religions and Cultures in Dialogue. And he highlights the dangers of hate speech and the importance of how we speak in the public sphere. And he says the defining feature of faith communities is faith and not fear, and surely not as people who promote any form of phobia, that means irrational fear that dehumanizes the other. our fellow citizens or neighbors. So I guess that's an important reminder for us. And we are called to be agents, active agents for peace and justice and reconciliation. And we are called to be a source of solutions rather than a source of conflict. Now, I started off with Andres Breivik said, the time for him, that time, and for some people, the time of dialogue is over. But rather, actually, I think now the time for dialogue is even more pressing, more important. So I'll end with this key insight I learned from my Catholic father, friend, scholar of Islam, interfaith dialogue, Father Daniel Madigan, on his approach to dialogue. And he said this. He said, there's no other choice for Christians in dialogue but to trust that the way of the humble Christ is the way to the truth. Let me repeat that again. That there's no other choice for Christians in dialogue, but to really go with to trust that the way of the humble Christ is the way to the truth. Because he said to enter into such humility always risky, because it could be easily be misinterpreted as weakness. But this is the risk that we cannot avoid. If we claim to be followers of Christ, he said, he made himself humble, yet accepting death on the cross. There is no other choice for Christians in dialogue, but to trust that the way of the humble Christ is the way to truth. So I leave that with you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share. Thank you for listening.